The slits were actually the first thing that I discovered in the Coconino, and the reason that I sent an email to John Whitmore at Cedarville College when I first saw it. And within 2 weeks, he and Ray Strom and Paul Gardner were at my door, and we went up into the mountains to look at it. But these slits, we didn't know what they were. John didn't know what they were.
Our guest, Guy Forsythe, recently presented at the Twin Cities Creation Association on September 17th, 2024, on the topic of latest findings regarding the Coconino Formation. I must say, Guy, that your presentation that covered the geology of the Coconino Sandstone was very concise and clear. Those that have not seen it can go to the Twin Cities Creation Science Association YouTube and see the 1 hour, 9-minute presentation. Guy Forsythe is the founder of Crying Rocks Ministry. Guy is married to Cindy Forsythe. After 10 years of asking God to prepare them for a ministry, upon Guy's retirement from teaching in Ohio, they started searching for a place where God would place them and be able to minister. They arrived in Sedona in June of 2003. There, God showed them that they were to simply open their hearts to loving the city, the people, and the visitors. Guy had 20 plus years of studying about evolution and creation as a basis for showing that God's word in the Bible is a true reality for all people. They are distributing now a creation news update each quarter to every home in Sedona, the village of Oak Creek, and Oak Creek Canyon in Arizona. The Sedona area has hundreds of hiking trails north, south, east, and west of Sedona, and Guy has hiked those in many areas off trail to discover and take pictures of parabolic recumbent folds in the Coconino Sandstone and other geologic formations. So, Guy, why did you name your creation ministry Crying Rocks Ministry?
Well, my wife came up with the idea. As we looked around, Luke 19:40 came to mind, which says, "But Jesus answered, I tell you, if these," which were his followers, "become silent, the stones will cry out." And it just seems like the rock formations around Sedona are just crying out about Jesus and the goodness of God. And that struck her, and she suggested the name, and I immediately thought it was a great name, and away we went.
Very good. Congratulations on your research. Many locations there in Sedona area where you found and documented the parabolic recumbent folds in the Coconino Sandstone and 2 other formations. And you published that data with pictures along with Dr. John Whitmore and Paul Gardner. Can you summarize the conclusions and how they support a catastrophic flood?
First of all, the Coconino is a battleground area in the creation versus naturalism battle. The naturalists say, well, this was established by sand being deposited through the air, and that would take millions of years. It couldn't happen in the middle of Noah's flood that you'd have sand deposited like this using the air. And of course, our contention is that it was deposited in water. And so it has just become kind of a focus in the battle, one of the big battlegrounds. And the summary of that research is basically we showed, I think, that the layers were laid down in water. We only dealt with the parabolic recumbent folds in our paper, but of course, I presented many lines of evidence in the talk that I gave the other night.
Yes.
But the parabolic folds are certainly a major part of that conclusion that we have, that it was deposited in water.
Well, one of the other evidences they shared about was some of the water features that are documented in the Coconino Sandstone. And I think it's, the sand size and the type of sand, the pipes that you saw, the slits, both vertical and horizontal. Can you expand on those?
The slits were actually the first thing that I discovered in the Coconino, and the reason that I sent an email to John Whitmore at Cedarville College when I first saw it. And within 2 weeks, he and Ray Strom and Paul Gardner were at my door, and we went up into the mountains to look at it. But these slits, we didn't know what they were. John didn't know what they were. It's one of those things where, in every profession, there are specialties. And John had never encountered them before, or if he had, he didn't realize he had. And when we put on a poster display at the 2011 Geological Conference in Minneapolis, of all places, we had several geologists walk up and say, "Oh, those are water escape features." Well, now we had a search term, so we could go looking and discover about water escape features. And we read paper after paper after paper on water escape features. And basically, it's something that is caused in an earthquake, though our paper was about deposition, not an earthquake. But it's water. When earthquakes happen and you have a sediment that's in thick, lots of water, the sediment and water try to separate. And generally what you get is a water pipe where the water shoots up vertically, because like electricity, it follows the path of least resistance. It shoots up vertically and you end up with what's called a water pipe, or in some cases, an injectite. That's when the material from below is what you see there is different from the material that's around it because it's come from deep below. That's pretty astounding because the water escape features we found do not go vertical, they go horizontal. And so that indicates that there was a lot of material deposited on top of this when the earthquake occurred, because the water shot, there was actually less resistance going horizontally rather than vertically. And so that really didn't come up in the paper, but I find that a really significant thing also because it talks about how fast that deposition would have occurred.
Thank you. Now, in your 2015 paper that's in the Answers Research Journal collection, you mentioned Aeolian sand dunes. And can you explain Aeolian to your listening audience and compare that to water laid down sedimentary layers?
There's so much jargon in geology. It's amazing. Aeolian basically means air. So if it's aeolian deposition, it's deposited in air. We believe that what we found is subaqueous, which means it's deposited in water. So the two terms are aeolian and subaqueous.
If you believe this sand was laid down by water, now the sand itself must be different than air laid down sand. Can you explain that little bit about the size and shape of the sand?
Well, we've got 13 lines of evidence for that we covered in the other night. But yeah, the naturalists proclaim that the sand is well-rounded and well-sorted. And if you look at it under a standard field glass, which magnifies by a factor of about 10, it does kind of look that way. But when you do thin sections and look at it where you're blowing it up 500 times, you can see that it is poorly sorted in most places, and the sand particles are subangular to subrounded. They are not well rounded at all. One of the things that I think is a big factor is the fact that we find mica in the Coconino sandstone. And mica is a very fragile material. And if it got blown around in the wind, it would be crunched up and ground down and be impossible to find. And one of John's students actually did an experiment where he blew around Coconino sandstone that had been crushed up, but not destroying the mica. And within a few days, the mica had been totally ground up. You couldn't find it anymore. Then he put it in water and ran it for a year, and you could still find flakes of mica because the water acts like a lubricant and a cushion so that the mica does not get destroyed. And that I think is really a strong evidence that it's deposited subaqueous rather than aeolian, because we do find large flakes of mica in the Coconino.
Thank you, guys. So for our listeners listening to this, our presentation again has pictures of mica, pictures of the sand sizes and shapes. So I recommend that you check out that YouTube site on TCCSA. Now, Guy, here's a tough question for you. What is your opinion as to where did all this sand come from and how was it created?
Okay, the naturalists believe that erosion occurred in the Appalachian Mountains, which at that time would have been, and they're thinking huge because they're one of the few mountain ranges that it's old. Most mountain ranges are considered to be 6 to 12 million years old by the naturalists. The Appalachians a couple hundred million years old, so they believe that a lot of erosion has occurred, so it was originally a lot taller mountains. Looking at zircon crystals, there is definitely a link between sandstones in the Appalachian Mountains and in the Coconino, and in particular in the Navajo sandstone. And the naturalists believe that there were rivers that came clear across the continent and brought that sand from the Appalachians to north of our area. And we found the Coconino now as far north as in Wyoming. So it would have to be north of there that the rivers flowed, deposited the sand, it dried out, and then a wind from the north blew it down south and deposited it as the Coconino and Navajo. So they see the Appalachians as the source. I think that the material that was eroded away at the beginning of Noah's flood got deposited in what became the Appalachian Mountains and carried clear across the continent to our area in the West. If you're familiar with Baumgartner and Clary and their work with tsunamis and looking at mega sequences, that makes a lot of sense. And it fits right in with their model of how the deposits were made during the flood.
Well, thank you. So again, summarizing, your understanding is the Appalachian Mountains were created earlier on during the flood year, and during that catastrophic flood, the mountains were sort of ground down from the catastrophic effects of the flood, and all that moved west and was deposited in many different layers of sand out in the west. Is that correct?
Well, I know. I think that as the tsunami came up and went across the land, it deposited what became the Appalachian Mountains and came right over here. And what was deposited here was deposited maybe a day later than what was deposited in the Appalachians. But
Okay.
a lot of research needs to be done yet. Clary and Baumgartner have just kind of, for the first time, come up with an outline of what, in my opinion, is a feasible process for the flood, but it needs a lot of development yet.
Okay, guys. So how can audiences get in touch with you if they want to follow up on some of these things?
They can email me at hello@cryingrocks.org or go to our website, cryingrocks.org, and they can get my information there. And if they'd like to get the newsletter, I have two email lists. One is when the newsletter's done, I just send out a link to the PDF and say the newsletter's available. So that happens 4 times a year. And the other, I have people that are praying for me as I'm writing the newsletter, and I'm putting in specific prayer requests as I write the newsletter. And that usually is about 3 emails per newsletter. And they're very brief, just a short paragraph, and that's it. And they can email me and say, put me on this list or that list, and I'll do that.
Well, thanks for that information. In conclusions, I'm going to share only the Bible gives an accurate record of the past that is consistently validated by science, archaeology, the fossil record, history, and geology. The Bible is the most trustworthy window to the past and present known to mankind. It clearly answers the universal questions: where did we come from? What are we here for? And where do we go from here? Well, God bless you, Guy, and thank you very much for being our guest on TCCSA Podcast.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
I'm Alan Walker, host of the Twin Cities Creation Science Association podcast. Thank you to Dr. Ross Olson for setting this podcast up.